We are a justice-making, truth-seeking people. We share a reverence for the mystery of life. Come. Come, let us worship together. To Bear Love into This World by Rachel Hayes. We light our chalice this morning with our hearts turned to the work of our congregation. We have inherited this institution from generations of people who believed in the power of human beings to bear love into the world. We carry this tradition for those who find comfort, inspiration, and joy within its real and virtual spaces. We tend the spark of imagination and hope for the world to come.
Please rise as you're willing and able, and join me in singing hymn number 298, Wake Now My Senses. Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in awe. Keep with the web of creation your vow, giving, receiving as love shows us how. Wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now, compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Wake now my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiance here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care.
The introduction of new information technology can be both exciting and frightening. Over the past 15 to 20 years, we have seen the rapid emergence of artificial intelligence and social media. While the combination of these two major technologies has great promise, it is also significantly frightening when it comes to the threats they pose to democracy, such as the amplification of polarization in society. Unfortunately, there is a mystique that surrounds these technologies that can lead to either shutting down because it seems too technical or complicated, or to just wishing it would go away and stop making our lives so difficult. You don't need a master's degree in computer science to understand the basics. We'll try to present these basics in a simple but effective way. Based on that understanding, we'll explore what the risks are to our democratic freedoms and why it matters to our democracy in general, as well as for UUs in particular. Finally, we'll explore a few principles for what could and should be done to address these risks.
The mission of Birmingham Unitarian Church is to be a free and welcoming religious community that encourages lives of integrity, learning, service, and joy. One way we live out this mission is by giving half of our weekly offering to a nonprofit organization that shares our values and addresses needs in one of these areas: environmental action, economic justice, civic engagement, and racial justice. We support a new organization each month. The plate share recipient for late July and August will go to Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, which works on evidence-based policies and community education in collaboration with other states and at the national level. In 2018, BUC passed a resolution affirming the need for changes in law and society to improve gun safety. Gun violence is in opposition to our 8 principles and is an issue that has implications for racial justice, social stability, and the democratic process. Let there be an offering in support of our beloved community and organizations that build the world we dream about. This morning's offering will now be received with gratitude. Ushers, please come forward. We are a church of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. With gratitude, we dedicate this offering to the good works of our congregation and dedicate ourselves to its service.
Each week, members of the community share words of joy or sorrow with the congregation. If you would like to share a joy or sorrow in a future service, you can click on Share Joys and Sorrows button on the BUC homepage, or you can arrive a bit early and write in the book at the back of the sanctuary. We have a few joys that were sent in beforehand. From Suki Darlington, it's a joy to be at home and no longer septic, and happiness is due to an outpouring of kind support. From Jane O'Neill, a joy from the BUC Environmental Action Team that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed by the Senate and the House and will become law soon. The act is the biggest climate legislation in history, and while there is much more to be done, this gives us real hope for our collective future here on Mother Earth. And one more joy from me. I want to thank Shannon Snyderman and Sarah Constantakis and all the volunteers for the fun field day yesterday. Among life's joys, we also share in each other's sorrows. From David and Stephanie Greer, our 25-year-old grandniece caught COVID and spent 5 weeks in intensive care in St. Louis. She now has been flown to Chicago for possibly an implanted heart assist pump. Please keep her in your thoughts. Many of us have unspoken joys and sorrows, and people whom we think of this morning. If you feel so moved, speak the names of those on your heart. Spirit that unites us, help us to rise to the challenges of today and do our part to bring about a better tomorrow. May we leverage the wonder of human technological advancement for the greater good of humanity. May we work to understand both the opportunities and the risks that the advancement of technology almost always brings. Respecting what we have learned, may we decide how we can best engage in the democratic process to enable the opportunities and reduce the risks, especially risks to those most vulnerable and risks to the democratic process itself.
Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Sing with me. Sing with me, sing with me, sing with me, oh my soul. Sing with me, sing with me, sing with me, oh my soul. Speak for me. Speak for me, speak for me, speak for me, oh my soul. Speak for me, speak for me, speak for me, oh my soul.
This reading is from the book God, Human, Animal, Machine, written by Megan O'Giblin. In 2008, Chris Anderson, the editor of Wired magazine, called for the end of modern science. This was the thrust of his blunt, well-circulated article, The End of Theory, The Data Deluge Makes the Scientific Method Obsolete. Anderson reviewed some of the impasses in physics and biology, though his argument extended into all disciplines, from quantum mechanics to the social sciences. We have long known, he asserted, that our theories are imperfect, even when they prove incredibly useful in predicting the world. As the statistician George Box memorably put it, all models are wrong, but some are useful. But Anderson believes that this pragmatic approach had changed with the advent of big data. We were now living in what he called the most measured age in history, an era defined by cloud computing and the petabyte, a unit of data that is roughly the equivalent of 799 million copies of Moby Dick. Information was now produced and collected on such an enormous scale that no human mind could make sense of it. The data deluge had completely subsumed us, rendering our best scientific ideas useless. Many readers dismissed his argument as alarmist. The piece seemed deliberately contrived to court controversy, but if anything, Anderson understated the point. In the year 2001 alone, the amount of information generated doubled that of all information produced in human history. In 2002, it doubled again, and this trend has continued every year since. As Anderson noted, researchers in virtually every field have so much information that it is difficult to find relationships between things and make predictions. The world contained in this data does not operate according to the neat Newtonian rules of cause and effect, but spirals into the baffling complexity of chaos theory, where everything is connected to everything else, and even small changes have widespread repercussions. Or rather, this is the world that had always been there, lurking beyond our limited understanding. It was only now that we were getting a glimpse of its bewildering scope. Anderson was not fatalistic about this development. He was merely calling for the adoption of a new approach. What companies like Google had discovered is that when you have data on this scale, you no longer need a theory at all. You can simply feed the numbers into algorithms and let them make predictions based on the patterns and relationships they notice. Google's search engine can accurately catch misspelled words and suggest corrections, even though the software has no theory of language. It has simply learned which suggestions work by observing trends that emerge from the enormous data set of real-world Google searches. Google Translate learned to translate English to French simply by scanning Canadian documents that contain both languages, even though the algorithm has no model that understands either. Peter Norvig, head of research at Google, once boasted that not a single person who worked on the Chinese translation program spoke Chinese. For Anderson, this proved that these mathematical tools could predict and understand the world more adequately than any theory could. Petabytes allow us to say, correlation is enough, he wrote. We can stop looking at models. We can analyze the data without hypotheses about what it might show. We can throw the numbers into the biggest computing clusters the world has ever seen and let statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot. Of course, data alone cannot tell us why something happens, but maybe, Anderson mused, our need to know why was misguided. Maybe we should stop trying to understand the world and instead just trust the wisdom of algorithms. Who knows why people do what they do, he wrote. The point is that they do it, and we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. At the time, many people in the tech industry found this conclusion troubling. Science depends on testable hypotheses. The simple fact that there is a correlation between two things does not explain anything, nor is it sufficient to chalk up the relationship to coincidence. The scientist's goal is to determine the underlying mechanisms, to be able to explain why things happen. As the computer science scientist Jaron Lanier pointed out in a response to the article, some folk remedies work despite the fact that no one can explain why. But this is why folk remedies are not considered science. Science is about understanding, he wrote. It's hard not to feel the futility of such objections. Understanding, like meaning, is an anthropocentric concept, one that information technologies were deliberately built to elide. In a way, Anderson's piece underscored the extent to which this technical logic has seeped into the real world we inhabit, such that even when information is decoded and given to us as output, we cannot always make sense of it or understand how the machine reached its conclusion. It would have been natural to conclude that such a world would have no value for us. Instead, we have done precisely what Anderson described, building sophisticated and largely opaque instruments to restore our broken relationship with the absolute.
Pretty amazing, eh? I want to start by thanking you all, online and in person here, for attending summer services at BUC. It means a lot to us worship associates, musicians, and others that help to bring about the service each week. I hope that your engagement is as meaningful to you as it is to us. Johannes Gutenberg brought the invention of movable type for character-based languages to Europe in the 15th century. It enabled people besides the wealthy and the priests to be able to afford books, starting with the Bible. It could be argued that this set the stage for people starting to think on their own when it came to how to read the Bible and understand the Word of God. What followed were 200 years of religious wars in Europe. Does this mean that someone should have stopped this technology that enabled a new level of information dissemination because of its potential dangers? We are facing similar challenges today, but on a global scale and on a time scale that it is an order of magnitude faster than the age of Gutenberg. Our world unfolds in months and years rather than decades and centuries. Our challenges cannot just be handed off to our children and grandchildren to solve. During the first 20 years of this century, two major advancements in information technology have started to transform society: artificial intelligence and social media. I refer to these as crises because they concurrently provide both opportunity and danger. Let's start with a brief description of what each of these two technologies are and what their potential benefit could be. I would no more want to throw these technologies out than I would suggest throwing out movable type that enabled the distribution of information more broadly in the 15th century. You may hear artificial intelligence or AI along with similar terms such as machine learning and others. I'm going to generalize all of these together because the way they are different than how we have programmed computers over the past 60-some years is fundamentally the same for all of them. Traditional computer programming, or what is also known as software engineering, involves someone writing a program which is comprised of the rules for the computer to follow. The computer takes these values, combines them with the data, and delivers result. For example, I can write a computer program to look through all orders, find any fulfilled based on shipping notice, and create an invoice for the customer. This kind of software engineering is the backbone of about every organization, as well as what we are using on our laptops, tablets, or smartphones. The significant difference with artificial intelligence or machine learning is that the model is essentially flipped. Known results are combined with data and fed into a computer that runs new algorithms. The algorithms generate the rules or programs. An example may help to make this clearer. Let's imagine I have a shopping website. I want to find out what causes people to buy goods on my site versus those who browse the site but never make a purchase. I take my results, customers who have bought things, and feed them into the computer together with the logs of everything that every customer did while on the website. The computer leverages advanced mathematical algorithms and gugobs of computing power, that's a technical term, to tell me what the rules are that distinguish between shoppers who purchased something and those who didn't. I then use these rules to figure out what I can do with someone who appears to be on a path that they could be nudged along by a 10% off coupon to make a purchase. This is also a good picture to help understand one of the risks of artificial intelligence. In traditional software engineering, the biggest risk is the work of the programmer understanding the rules and coding them correctly for the computer to deliver the right results. While mistakes are certainly still made, we know from decades of experience how to find and correct these mistakes. But in the machine learning world, it's the data and previous results fed into the computer that make the difference. For example, let's say I'm a young white man working together with hundreds of other young white men in Silicon Valley to develop facial recognition software using machine learning. I need to be able to validate my results. Therefore, I need some faces that I can associate with a name. and then see if the computer can predict correct matches. Where do I get a set of faces associated with the correct names? I know. I can collect the pictures of all my friends on Facebook and use them as a training set of data. Is it any wonder that I have successfully trained the computer to recognize these faces, but the software doesn't perform as well on the faces of people of color? Let's take a look at two highly valuable uses for artificial intelligence. There are many treatments for particular diseases that seem to be just okay on average. They may work wonders for some people, but do very little to cure others. Concurrently, there are often several of these just okay treatments available for the same condition. What if we could capture the genetic code for everyone for whom the treatment worked and for all those for whom it didn't? It is highly likely that we don't have 4 or 5 average treatments. We may very well have 4 or 5 excellent treatments for people who share a particular segment of genetic code that responds best to only one of the treatments. With a comprehensive database of everyone's genetic code, appropriately controlled and anonymized, we may be able to save millions of lives every year. Digital image processing is a problem space that lends itself well to artificial intelligence. When I was working on my master's degree in computer science in the 1980s, digital image processing consisted primarily of enhancing satellite images so that a human could potentially spot things like tanks or rocket launchers on the ground. Today, image recognition driven by artificial intelligence is able to interpret real-time images from all 360 degrees around a vehicle and act far more quickly than human response time. It continues to amaze me that we respond to many tragedies where a handful of people die, but just accept as a given that on average over 30,000 people in the United States die in automobile accidents every year. I am sure that a few decades from now, children will be asking their parents, "You mean they let people drive these things? How dangerous that must have been." What are social media? Sometimes the contributors to Wikipedia can state it quite succinctly. They define social media as having these 4 major components. The first point refers to Web 2.0. When the World Wide Web started to rapidly expand in the 1990s, it was first a presentation vehicle. Wow, I can go online and see what a university halfway around the world looks like. From there, it started to enable transactions, or what we call e-commerce. I can order stuff online and have it delivered without having to drive to the store and be frustrated with the item being out of stock. This was Web 1.0. The transition to interactivity that started to take place in the early 2000s is what the authors refer to as Web 2.0, that enables text posts, sharing pictures and videos, and enabling interaction. What's critically important in the third and fourth points is the creation of user profiles and the electronic connecting of people in a social network. Social networks are not something new. They've been around since there were human beings. We began to understand them with the development of the discipline of sociology in the late 19th century. However, social media enable these networks to transcend the limitations of space and time by facilitating ongoing dialogue with those who may have moved far away from us, as well as establishing new social connections with people whom we've never met in person. What are the opportunities for social media? Pictures and short videos enable connecting with loved ones when they live far away. It's great to watch our grandniece growing up in North Carolina. I've found LinkedIn a godsend in terms of connecting over time. People move on, change their employer, change their email addresses, but I can still reach out and reconnect. The power of social network itself is incredible. Through second-degree connections, that is, someone who knows someone I know, I've been able to find new friends or business colleagues. I feel great sympathy for people who think they are all alone in the world. Consider what it's like for a transgender youth living in a small town being able to connect to a virtual support group that doesn't exist locally. But even with all these opportunities for both social media and artificial intelligence, we get a sense that things aren't right. These technologies, with all their positive potential power to have divided us even more forcefully than they've connected us. Truth itself seems to have gone out the window. Automated fake users, known as bots, foment physical violence in the real world, not just tempests in a teapot on Twitter or Facebook. The most eye-opening authors for me on these two topics have been Shoshana Zuboff and Cathy O'Neil. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, the fight for a human future at the frontier of power, focuses on social media and its connection to artificial intelligence. For a very short synopsis of Shoshana Zuboff, read her New York Times op-ed from January 29th of 2021. Weapons of Mass Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy, provides an important framework for looking at the risks of bringing together big data and artificial intelligence. Cathy O'Neil refers to the misuse of the application of advanced mathematics to big data as weapons of math destruction. How did we get where we are now? In the late 1990s, hundreds of companies were competing to use the innovative technology of the World Wide Web. The problem was that, while they were losing money on every transaction, they figured they could make it up by acquiring market share. Google was one of those companies. While they had a great search engine, they were struggling as the dot-com bust came along, with many believing they weren't going to survive as a company. But they discovered that they could collect and retain everything that you did, not only on their search engine, but also on other websites where they planted tracking cookies, little tiny programs that run in the background without you knowing it, to keep track of all that you were doing. Leveraging this information, they could start to sell targeted ads based on your searches and your web behavior. Your first reaction might be, but what right did they have to take my data without my permission? The problem is that nobody had said they couldn't. Google decided that they would just declare it so, and you would agree to it. And you did. And you continue to agree to this arrangement every time you click on an I agree of a 40-some page document that was called an agreement for the right to use their services. Google was just the beginning. Over at Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg was challenged with the same issue, but he believed he could out-Google Google. And to be sure he got it right, Zuckerberg brought in Sheryl Sandberg, Google's vice president of global online sales and operations, to help him fix what he was doing wrong when it came to emulating Google. She became the chief operating officer at Facebook. Google may know what you're doing online, but Facebook can get far more valuable information to sell to advertisers by getting people to create personal profiles. We provide all sorts of personal information: who our friends are, whether we have children or not, what our hobbies are, what we like, what we don't like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are not customers of Facebook. We are the suppliers of raw material. How many industries can you think of that get their raw material for free and then sell their product and make more money than any other companies have made in history? This is why Shoshana Zuboff calls this surveillance capitalism. We aren't victims of a surveillance state. It is the world's largest companies that are doing the surveillance. And while this may not seem like a bad thing, when it comes to democracy, it is probably worse. As a colleague of mine would say when we had just produced what we thought was a great idea, but one riddled with risks, what could possibly go wrong? We touched briefly on data bias earlier. To take this a step further, what happens when policing agencies are using images from the scene of a crime and facial recognition software to identify criminals when we know that this software has a poorer rate of correct identification for people of color? Google, Facebook, and many others have asserted their ownership of our data. In the US, we have almost no control over what happens to it. It's one thing to get phishing emails because someone stole our email address, but what happens when companies use our web browsing history to deny us a loan to buy a house? What decisions are the opaque algorithms used by social media platforms making? Facebook and others have refused to let experts who sign non-disclosure agreements determine what is going on with these algorithms and what potential problems they are creating for all of us or for certain classes of people. The most insidious problem arises from these algorithms is that they are driven by targeted advertising. The social media platforms have done extensive research to determine what makes people stay engaged longer so that the platforms can display more revenue-generating advertisements to them. Unfortunately, people will tend to engage more with that which makes them angry than with anything else. This is certainly one of the risks to our democracy when what we do on social media helps to make us more polarized as a society. This gets even more dangerous when bad actors set about exploiting this through bots to not only stoke up anger, but set up confrontations in the physical world, such as sending different targeted messages to violence-prone individuals on both the right and the left to show up at a given time and place. The ability to gin up conspiracy theories and amplify them through social media has started to lead to an elevated level of relativism when it comes to the question, what is truth? Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, realized how powerful a big lie is if it is repeated often enough. Even if people don't immediately believe, the extensiveness of the sharing on social media supports the idea that not only can we have our own opinions, we can also have our own version of the truth. Why is this important to use? There is an anti-science ideology that is being spread both inadvertently and advertently. Besides being espoused by anti-democratic forces such as Proud Boys and their ilk, as Megan O'Gliblin pointed out in the reading that Sarah gave, it is being espoused by the very people who are in charge of the technology platforms that are enabling this ideology. While there are many forces driving anti-democratic ideology today, artificial intelligence and social media are becoming a real threat to freedom and democracy. This is clearly not in line with either our sources or our principles. The subtitle of Zuboff's New York Times op-ed is, "We may have democracy or we may have surveillance society, but we cannot have both." I am not proposing specific actions for each of us to take. Rather, I want to point to what I believe is a huge undertaking, but is nonetheless optimistic. In her book, Zuboff challenges us to optimism in the spirit of George Orwell's 1946 critique of a colleague who believed that totalitarianism was inevitable. Orwell wrote, quote, "He was obeying the same instinct, the instinct to bow down before the conqueror of the moment, to accept the existing trend as irreversible." End quote. Taking the long view, Zuboff puts forth three principles for how we as a society can and should move forward. First, the democratic rule of law. We have already seen some successes for democracy, particularly in the areas of ownership and protection of your data. The European Union has implemented the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. California has passed an equivalent law known as CCPA. Creating a federal law modeled on these two successes would be a step in the right direction. This is far from the whole story, but it provides examples of democracy at work. New conditions summon new rights. The Fourth Amendment focused on the right to be secure in the physical world. Our, quote, persons, houses, papers, and effects, end quote. Zuboff points out that, quote, our elemental epistemic rights are not codified in law because they had never come under systematic threat, any more than we have laws to protect our rights to stand up, sit down, or yawn, end quote. We have to challenge the so-called originalists who would argue that we don't need to protect our virtual world because there was no virtual world in the 18th or 19th centuries. Unprecedented harms demand unprecedented solutions. We make a profound mistake when we accept that corporations can collect data without restrictions. We fall further into a trap when we beg them to be the police of what is happening on their platforms because of that purloined data. Off script slightly. Just saw an article on TikTok and all the worries about what the Chinese state is going to do with, quote, our information, with no mention what US-based corporations are already doing way more than TikTok is doing with our information. In other words, what Zuboff points out is that we're playing around downstream. Quote, downstream is where the companies want us to be, so consumed in the details of the property contract that we forget the real issue, which is that their property claim itself is illegitimate, end quote. This is where Zuboff challenges us to think big. As a country, we thought big in the past. We must do so now. Quoting Zuboff one last time, we can prohibit commercial practices that exert demand for rapacious data collection. Democratic societies have outlawed markets that trade in human organs and babies. Markets that traded human beings were outlawed, even when they supported whole economies, end quote. I spent 4 decades of my life focused on the benefits of information technology. More specifically, I spent the last 7 years of my career at the forefront of big data and artificial intelligence. These technologies offer tremendous promise for the future. The problem is not the technology, it is how we as a democratic society choose to govern it. The choice is ours to make.
Please rise as you're willing and able and sing our last hymn, number 318, We Would Be One. We would be one as now we join in singing hymn of love to pledge ourselves anew to that high cause of greater understanding of who we are and what in us is true. We would be one in living for each other to show to all a new community. We would be one in building for tomorrow a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which binds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves to greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
Go now into this world as a beacon of hope and joy. Go in love, go in peace. Now that our worship has ended, our service begins. May it be so. Amen. Blessed be.